We welcome Nigel, who's going to give the presentation today. The Graf Spee, I'm sure you'll find it's a very interesting story, and I'm sure Nigel will make it very interesting. Nigel's had a very extensive business career, taking him all over the world. He's currently the president of the Western Australia chapter of the Naval Historical Society. And in retirement, I think he's devoted all that energy and passion that he had to do the jobs before. His father was in the Royal Navy, and that probably contributed to his passionate interest in naval things. He is also a commentator on the Capital Community Radio. And as a lot of people do in retirement, they give something back, and he gives something back to the homeless people of Perth. So without any more ado, Nigel, it's all yours.
I've got some personal links to this story I just want to mention, and that's sometimes the reason why I put these talks together. And in my case, the link is my mother to this story, and who grew up in Buenos Aires. And by the way, we have another member of the society online here, in fact, two people, but one particular person, Caroline Mowbray, who also grew up in Montevideo, and her family knew Millington Drake very well, that we're going to talk about in a short while. So let's move on. So just a few, I'm going to just move some of this stuff to the side because I can't see. That's it, that's gone. So just a few acknowledgements. You can see where I've got some of my material from. I think it's always important to acknowledge sources, and including Warwick Archer that I met a few years ago. He'd been down to Buenos Aires and he took a number of photos and shared them with me. And so I've got some of his material in this as well. So this is a slide of my mother, who's as a wee young girl, at the age of 4, left Yorkshire in England for Argentina in the 1920s with her parents, my grandparents. She grew up in Buenos Aires and worked in the British Embassy. And here's the British Embassy. And through the war, and my mother was a personal assistant to the British ambassador to Argentina, to Esmond Ovey. There he is, there's the man. And she was heavily involved in monitoring the demise of the Graf Spee from the British Embassy, in liaison with the British Embassy in Montevideo, where one of her duties was sending secret ciphers back to the Foreign Office and the Admiralty in London, detailing the events as they unfolded. And my mother told me she heard the sound quite clearly when the Graf Spee finally blew up. And after serving in the Royal Navy throughout the war, as Noel has said, my father's first posting in the diplomatic service was to Buenos Aires, the British diplomatic service, in 1946, where he met my mother. They married, and they subsequently, my older brother and I were born in Buenos Aires. So I'm apparently known as a porteño. If you're born in a port city, you're called a porteño in Argentina. And my mother and father both then worked for Sir David Kelly, and he was an Australian. He was born in South Australia, went on to have a very distinguished career in the British diplomatic service, in fact, became British ambassador in Moscow. So let's move on. So following the end of the World War I, the German armed forces became subject to the restriction of the Treaty of Versailles. And for the new Reichsmarine, the German Navy, this meant it was limited to 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, 6 old light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats. And a further 2 pre-dreadnoughts, 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers and torpedo boats apiece could be kept in reserve. And the treaty also stipulated that Germany could replace its pre-dreadnought battleships after they reached 20 years of age, but new vessels could displace no more than 10,000 long tons. And in response to these limitations, the Germans started to build powerful heavy cruisers classified as a Panzerschiff, armored ship that outclassed the new heavy cruisers built by Britain and France. And British and French heavy cruiser designs were bound by the Washington and Naval Treaty and subsequent London Naval Treaty to a caliber of 8-inch guns on a displacement of 10,000 tons. So the Germans chose to arm the Deutschland, the first Panzerschiff, with 6 11-inch guns that was launched on the 19th of May, 1931. Right, here we have the famous Graf Spee. There's the flag of the German Navy, the Reichsmarine at the time during the war. Its builder, the Reichsmarine Werft in Wilhelmshaven, laid down on the 1st of October 1932, launched on the 30th of June 1934, and commissioned on the 6th of January 1936. Now, the Germans addressed these limitations with profound thought and great masterly skill in design and engineering in producing the Deutschland and the Graf Spee. Also, a massive ingenious deception akin to the deception, dare I say, by Volkswagen in relation to emission standards of their cars. But they're incredible engineers, the Germans, as we know. So both ships were armed with 2 triple 11-inch turrets and numerous smaller caliber guns. And their 26-knot speed and compressed armor meant that on open seas, no single British cruiser could match them. This class of ship would later be described as a pocket battleship. So in 1932, the Reichsmarine secured the passage of the Schiffbauersatzplan, and that's the replacement ship construction program, through the Reichstag. And the program called for 2 separate production phases, the first from 1930 to 36, and the second from 36 to 1943. The latter phase was secretly intended to break the Versailles restrictions, and the following year, Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. He unilaterally withdrew from the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles and began the systematic rebuilding of the armed forces. Right, let's now move on to the key commanders involved in the Battle of the River Plate. Another picture of the Graf Spee. So Hans Langsdorff, he was the captain of the Graf Spee. He was born on the 20th of March, 1894 in Bergen on the island of Rügen. It's Germany's largest island, situated in the Baltic Sea, and should not be confused with Bergen in Norway. The Norwegians certainly wouldn't like that. He was the eldest son in a family with legal and religious traditions rather than a naval tradition. And in 1898, the family moved to Düsseldorf, where they were neighbors of the family Graf. Graf in German means count in German. So they moved to Maximilian von Spee, who was to become a German naval hero whilst losing his life at the Battle of the Falklands in 1914. Indeed, the Graf Spee that Langsdorff would eventually command was named after Count Graf Spee. So influenced by his honored neighbors, Langsdorff entered the Kiel Naval Academy against his parents' wishes in 1912. And during the First World War, the then Lieutenant Langsdorff received the Iron Cross, second class at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, and subsequently worked on minesweepers for the rest of the war. He received the Iron Cross first class sometime during the remainder of the war, but the exact date is unknown. And by April 1930, he'd been promoted to Lieutenant Commander, and in 1931, he was recalled to Berlin as his administrative abilities had become well known and appreciated. And following the rise to power of the Nazis, Langsdorff requested duty at sea in 1934, but was instead appointed to the Interior Ministry. It's interesting, he was keen to get off to sea rather than remain in Berlin with the Nazi hierarchy. And in 1936 and 37, while on board the new pocket battleship Graf Spee, as part of the staff of Admiral Böhm, Langsdorff participated in German support of the nationalist side in the Spanish Civil War. And on the 1st of January 1937, Langsdorff was promoted to captain. He received command of the Graf Spee in October 1938. Right, let's talk about the person on the other side, Henry Harwood. Sir Henry Harwood. He entered the Royal Navy in 1904 and specialized in torpedoes. He served in the First World War. In 1919, he served on the battleship HMS Royal Sovereign, the first battle squadron, and by 1929, he'd been promoted to captain, became the commanding officer of the destroyer HMS Warwick, a senior officer of the 9th Destroyer Division. And in September 1936, Harwood was appointed Commodore and given command of the South American Division of the America and West Indies Station, whilst at the same time serving as commanding officer of the cruiser HMS Exeter. And at the outbreak of the Second World War, the command of HMS Exeter passed to Captain F.S. Bell. Now, Harwood's squadron consisted, let's just talk about this. Harwood's squadron consisted of the heavy cruisers HMS Cumberland and the light cruiser HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles, which was loaned to New Zealand in 1936 before formally joining the new Royal New Zealand Navy in 1941. He flew his pennant on HMS Ajax as his flagship, and the squadron was deployed to the South Atlantic at the outbreak of the war, where in due course the squadron encountered the Graf Spee. Now, before moving on to the Battle of the River Plate itself, there is an equally interesting and really fascinating story to tell about the fate suffered by numerous merchant ships that were sunk by the Graf Spee well before the Battle of the River Plate. When the Graf Spee first headed into the Atlantic Ocean on August 21st, 1939, before the war was declared between Britain and Nazi Germany, she sailed with the express intention of being ready and in position to attack any merchant shipping supporting the British and the Allies. So here's the Graf Spee and the supply ship Altmark. The Germans, unlike Britain, did not have strategically positioned bases around the world, such as Gibraltar and Falkland Islands, Ascension Island, as well as other ports they could head for, such as Freetown, Cape Town and Ceylon, and so on. So a support ship was absolutely vital to a ship such as the Graf Spee when operating thousands of miles away from its German home port. So let's now run through the grim list of ships that were seized. Their crews were taken prisoner. The ships then sunk and the crew normally looking on helplessly from the Graf Spee. It's another interesting fact that not one single life was lost of any of the crews who became prisoners on board the Graf Spee. You can read amazingly interesting accounts by members of the crew and their captains as to life on board the Graf Spee and how they were treated by Captain Langsdorff and his crew. And Langsdorff, despite, let's face it, being on the wrong side, as it were, seems to have been characterized by many historians as being a real officer and a gentleman of the highest standing in the true spirit of naval tradition. He also had great respect for the crews that he captured, as well as for the crew on the Graf Spee. So I'm going to now talk through the 9 captures and the sinkings that Langsdorff was involved in. Just before we do that, August 21st, the Graf Spee heads deep into the Atlantic together with a supply tanker to support ship Altmark. As I said, it was used for supplies, refueling, and for the transfer of captured prisoners. And under the prize rules of the Hague Convention of 1899 and 1907, Captain Langsdorff would evacuate crews before sinking merchant ships. And here's a picture of the Altmark in Jossing Fjord in Norway, and we'll talk a little bit more about the story on that later on. So ships sunk by the Graf Spee during 1939. 30th of September, SS Clement, she was intercepted by the Graf Spee 50 miles off the northeastern Brazilian coast. The Graf Spee gave orders not to operate the radio, but the wireless operator sent the distress signal and the ship's position. Passengers and crew were taken off as prisoners. Clement was sunk by gunfire. And the crew were sent to the boats and were left to make their way to land, having been given the correct course back to the South American port of Maceió on the eastern coast of Brazil. They all reached Maceió safely on the 1st of October. Here's a fantastic picture. This is Captain FCP Harris, he's center, there he is, of the Clement, including the standing with the German officers, and Langsdorff is in the background here, and another of Clement's crew watching their vessel, the Clement, sink. There's a crew member. Amazing photography. The Germans, of course, had amazing cameras, Leica and other cameras. They have fantastic lenses. Voigtlander, my father had a Voigtlander camera for years as he traveled around the world. And and now we move to the 5th of October, the second victim, the Newton Beach. And she was on a voyage from Table Bay to London with 7,000 tons of maize. And she was stopped by the Graf Spee about 480 miles southeast of Ascension Island. The wireless operator managed to get an SOS distress signal off. And on the 7th of October, the SS Ashley was captured and the crew placed on the Newton Beach after the combined crews were again transferred, this time to the Graf Spee. And then Newton Beach was sunk by Graf Spee on the 8th of October off the coast of Angola. And October the 5th, you can see the crew of the Newton Beach approaching the Graf Spee. So there's the Newton Beach and they're rowing towards the Graf Spee. And here we go, victim 3, October 7th, the SS Ashley was captured by the Graf Spee between Cape Town and Freetown. Crew of the Ashley were transferred to the Newton Beach, and after a small part of Ashley's cargo of sugar had been removed, the Ashley was sunk. Germans obviously like the sugar with their coffee. And on the 8th of October, all the prisoners from the Newton Beach and the Ashley were taken on board Graf Spee, and the Newton Beach was sunk. And here you can see the crewmen watch from the Graf Spee as one of the scuttling charges explodes on the Ashley. The Newton Beach is in the background. There's a scuttling charge going off, and there's the Newton Beach in the background. And here's October 7th, there's crewmen from the Ashley on board the Graf Spee. So you've got the crewmen wandering around here. And here you have some crew from the Graf Spee, the German Eagle with the swastika. Amazing resolution of this photography, as I say again. And we're now on victim 4, 10th of October, the Huntsman in 1939, captured by the Graf Spee en route from Liverpool with a general cargo from India and East Africa. A prize crew were placed on board the Huntsman, and the Graf Spee headed southwest and joined the Altmark, from which she refueled on the 14th of October. And the Huntsman was used as a supply ship by the Graf Spee until being sent to the bottom on the 17th of October, some 600 miles off Ascension Island. And 18th of October, all the captured British seamen were transferred to the Altmark from the Graf Spee, which then parted company again for 10 days. Neither Ashley or Huntsman could send distress messages, and suspicion was not really aroused until they became overdue at Freetown in Sierra Leone. And here's the Huntsman, sunk on the 17th of October. I'll talk a bit about the diary of Captain Albert Horace Brown of the Huntsman. That's where she got sunk. A pretty, lonely part of the place to go down. And here's the crew of the Huntsman being transferred to the Altmark. Again, amazing resolution. This is one of the boats from the Graf Spee. And October 17th, the supply ship Altmark, there she is in the center of the photo, and the Huntsman in the far distance, a scene from the Graf Spee. And the crew of the Huntsman, except for Captain Brown, have been transferred to the Altmark, and shortly afterwards, the Huntsman was sunk using charges. So they took the captain on board the Graf Spee and sent the rest of them to the Altmark. So we now move to the 5th victim, 22nd of October, a motor vessel Trevanian, and in the afternoon of 22nd of October, about midway between St. Helena and the west coast of Africa, the Graf Spee captured and sank Trevanian. She was homeward bound from Swansea, from Fremantle in WA, with a cargo of zinc concentrates. And during the next 6 days, Graf Spee steered to the southwest away from the trade routes, and on 28th of October met the Altmark near Tristan da Cunha, roughly between the Cape of Good Hope and the east coast of South America. And after refueling from the Altmark, the crew of the Trevanian were transferred to the Altmark, and the Graf Spee also set course to the Indian Ocean. There's a Trevonian sinking, seen from the Graf Spee. You just see her bow as she slides under the water. It actually looks pretty calm conditions on that day. And we now move on. Victim 6, 15th of November, the Africa Shell. I think this was owned by the Shell Oil Company, so they weren't very pleased. Sighted by the Graf Spee on the northern approach to Delegado Bay, 6 miles off the coast of Mozambique. And the Africa Shell was on passage to Lorenzo Marques in Mozambique. And the crew were allowed to get away on boats and landed safely in Lorenzo Marques. And Captain Dove was taken prisoner, and the Africa Shell was sunk 160 miles northeast of Lorenzo Marques. So Langsdorff had this thing of often letting the crew land somewhere safely, but always nobbling the captain. And so Captain Patrick Dove remained a prisoner of war aboard the Graf Spee until the ship arrived in Montevideo in Uruguay on December 14th, 1939, following the Battle of the River Plate. And in press interviews following his release, he said of Captain Hans Langsdorff, the commanding officer of the Graf Spee, "There is no mercy from Langsdorff when he is fighting, has fighting to do, but when he is not fighting, he's a fine gentleman. Langsdorff was a strict disciplinarian aboard the Graf Spee. He enforced fair and equal treatment. British prisoners received the same food as the German crewmen, even when supplies ran low." And Captain Dove also told a reporter of the Argentine newspaper La Libertad that when he was captured off Africa, he only had a tropical uniform. But when they moved into the northern colder waters, Langsdorff had the ship's tailor make him a complete set of clothes out of wool. Langsdorff also gave him a pipe, as his had been lost on the Africa Shell. And he also was given a receipt for other personal belongings, including the sextant from the Africa Shell. Can you imagine this happening today? He got a receipt for the loss of his sextant. So November 15th, 39, the Africa Shell seen from the Graf Spee. There's the launch from the Graf Spee is alongside, and the crew can be seen gathered at the stern. Okay, victim number 7, December 2nd, 1939, the Doric Star was en route for Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK from New Zealand, via Sydney and Cape Town with a cargo of frozen meat, dairy produce and wool, and the Doric Star was intercepted by Graf Spee about 500 miles off Damara Land, Southwest Africa, and the passengers and crew were taken off, as well as some provisions, and the Doric Star was sunk by bombs and a torpedo. When you say bombs, they had an aircraft on board that they could launch that could drop bombs. That was subsequently destroyed during the Battle of the River Plate, but we'll talk about that later. And despite warnings, the wireless operator had managed to get off a radar distress call with her position. Quite important, that one. And here's the Doric Star photograph from the Graf Spee and being hit by a 5.9-inch shell. Wow. That's the end of the Doric Star. And December 2nd, crewmen are rowing away from the Doric Star to board the Graf Spee. And it's interesting to me, you see they've probably got their best clothes on. Many of them have got their sort of Homburg hats and cloth caps, and they're rowing away from the Doric Star. I mean, merchant seamen didn't dress in any kind of fancy way. So, 8th of December, the 8th victim, December 3rd, 1939, the SS Teora. Early in the morning, the Teora on voyage from Brisbane to London with a cargo of frozen meat, wool and lead was intercepted by the Graf Spee. Langsdorff hoped to capture her as a tinder, but Graf Spee's gunfire damaged her rudder, and so Teora was sunk with a torpedo after taking off all her crew, and she sank off the coast of Southwest Africa. There she is, going down, another victim. I mean, you can see that the Graf Spee was incredibly successful at doing the job that it set out to do, which is to destroy Allied convoys bringing supplies. Okay, the Graf Spee's last merchant ship capture and sinking was the Strømsholm. That's the Viking word for Nordic name for Whitby in Yorkshire in England. And on the 6th of December, as Graf Spee met the Altmark for the last time, most of the prisoners being transferred to the Altmark, and the field was taken on by Graf Spee. And on December 7th, 1939, some 1,000 miles east of Sao Francisco, Brazil, Stronasal was on a voyage from Rosario, Montevideo to London with wheat grain when she was stopped by the Graf Spee. The crew was taken off and the Stronasal was sunk. And interesting, Langsdorff, he managed to retrieve certain papers on the Stronasal, brought to his cabin, and Langsdorff felt his best course was for Montevideo from what he was reading, and the River Plate, where more victims for sinking were available. And here's the captured crew of the Stronasal on the stern of the Graf Spee. You can see them all standing here looking hopeless as they look on hopelessly as their ship awaits sinking on the 7th of December, 1939. There she is. Amazing photography against some of Graf Spee's crew wandering around here, and they're all over here, some of them with their life jackets on. Right. So I think we've gone through all the sinkings. Before we move to, as I say, to the Battle of the River Plate itself, which in time terms was comparatively short battle, only some 2 hours, I want to briefly finish again the story in regard to the Altmark, the supply and prison ship to the Graf Spee. The Altmark, under the command of Captain Henrik Dow, was assigned to support the Graf Spee during her raid in the South Atlantic between September and December 1939. As previously mentioned, seamen rescued from the ship sunk by the Graf Spee were ultimately transferred to the Altmark. So after the Graf Spee was scuttled by her crew in the Rio de la Plata in December 1939, the Altmark attempted to return to Germany, steaming around the north coast of Great Britain, and then taking a course very close into the Norwegian coastline. And on February the 14th, 1940, the Altmark, proceeding south within Norwegian territorial waters, was discovered by 3 British Lockheed Hudson aircraft from RAF Thornaby in North Yorkshire in England, and also pursued by several British destroyers led by the famous HMS Cossack. So late on the 16th of February, the Cossack entered Jussing Fjord in Norway, where the Altmark had hidden herself. The Royal Navy made their intentions clear, while the Norwegian Navy stood by and took no action to save except for raising a protest flag, as Norway still remained neutral at that point. They hadn't yet been invaded by the Nazis. And I think we all know the rest of the story. The crew from the Cossack boarded it, found all these prisoners on board the Altmark. They were all released and went back to Blighty, to England, and were very pleased to see the Royal Navy releasing them. And here's the secret cipher to the British Admiralty from the Cossack, 17th of February, advising all prisoners successfully released from the Altmark. That was another huge boost to morale. So let's move on. Now, subsequently, because Hitler feared Norway would not be sufficiently resolute to protect the German iron ore traffic that passed legitimately, in theory, along the Norwegian coastline, and Admiral Erich Raeder's urging. Raeder was still head of the German Navy at that time. Dönitz, as we know, eventually took over. Hitler decided on the invasion of Norway and Denmark in March 1940. Denmark fell within a few days, but the Norwegians fought on very, very bravely for several months before they were taken over. I have some Norwegian relatives, and now long gone, but they talked about the the German invasion of Norway. It was pretty vicious stuff. So the Altmark eventually was repaired and went on serving as a prison and supply ship, but was renamed the Uckermark. And in September 1942, she left France in her new role as the replenishment ship for the German raider Tor, which was raiding merchant ships in the Indian Ocean and indeed the Western Pacific Ocean, including Australian ships. And on the 30th of November 1942, the Uckermark, the Altmark, was anchored in Yokohama, Japan, next to the Tor and an Australian passenger liner, the Nanking. which Tor had captured in March, 5 days out from Fremantle, en route to Colombo, Ceylon. And while the crew was at lunch, the Uckermark suffered a huge explosion that ripped the vessel apart. The Uckermark, the Tor, and the Nanking were all sunk by the explosion, and the cause of the explosion was thought to be a spark from a tool used by a repair gang working near the cargo tank. So that was the end of the Altmark, the Uckermark. So this was all caused by tradies who slipped up and blew all the ships up. So I think they were in big trouble. Right, now let's talk about, move on to the actual Battle of the River Plate. And here's a wonderful picture of the Graf Spee at the Grand Naval Review for the coronation of King George VI, Spithead, May 1937. It's amazing to think this all was happening not very long before we all went to war and we had the Battle of the River Plate. So Captain Langsdorff's strategy was to make a brief appearance, claim a victim, and then vanish undetected into the trackless ocean. And on November 15th, as I mentioned, while sailing down the Mozambique Channel between the island of Madagascar and the continent of Africa, Captain Langsdorff ordered the destruction of the British tanker Africa Shell, as I described. But this was merely a trick, a tactic to register her position and draw the British hunting groups towards the Indian Ocean. And once Langsdorff knew his presence had been detected, he promptly steamed with all speed well south of the Cape and re-entered the South Atlantic. So he's very clever at trying to get people off his scent. He thinks, oh, they'll think I'm in the Indian Ocean. Now I'll nip back into the South Atlantic. He's very smart, very clever captain. And it wasn't until the week of December 2nd to 7th that the British had realized that the Graf Spee had slipped back into the Atlantic when she registered 3 more kills, one of which being the Doric Star, which managed to get off a signal to indicate the position of the raider, as I also previously described. Now, this was very, very important in helping to identify the location of the Graf Spee to the Royal Navy in the South Atlantic. Now, Langsdorff now had 2 options before him. He could head north to the safety of a German port and return to a hero's triumph, or have the Graf Spee continue on her present course until she reached the River Plate 3, where the richest prizes in enemy shipping would be offered to her. While the rest of the British Admiralty were at a loss as to the Graf Spee's next move, it was Commodore Harwood who figured correctly that Langsdorff would choose the latter of his 2 options. So Harwood's assignment at the time was to protect the shipping lanes in and around the River Plate and South America. So Harwood ordered 3 of his cruisers, the 8-inch HMS Exeter and the 2 6-inch cruisers Ajax and Achilles, to meet 150 miles east of the River Plate and await their foe. And so let's now look at some splendid photos of the ships that made up Harwood's squadron. Here she is, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles. And here's HMS Achilles seen from HMS Ajax. Splendid photograph. And also now let's look at where the battle took place. And so we're clear where we're talking about. Here we have South America and Argentina, the huge country of Brazil, Uruguay. And so the battle took place in this estuary. This is the estuary of the River Plate, Rio de Plata. Let's move in a bit closer here, smaller scale map. And this is where the Graf Spee finally met her end off Montevideo. There's Buenos Aires, where my mother was working. And just as a matter of interest, for those interested in corned beef, you've all heard of Fray Bentos. Well, there's Fray Bentos. That's where it all comes from. Corned beef, that's Fray Bentos in Uruguay. Okay, so let's go to this now. Move these slides along a bit. You don't need that one. Let's talk to this one. That's good. So the actual Battle of the River Plate, we're talking the 13th of December, 1939. timeline of the battle, 0600 hours, so 0800 hours. I had this came from Captain Roskill's book, who was commissioned to do the official history of the Royal Navy, as many of you will know. So at 6:14 on the 13th, 150 miles east of the River Plate estuary, the Graf Spee was reported spotted on the northwest of Exeter, Ajax and Achilles. So there's the first little red dot. So that's the first thing to think about and look at. And faced with Graf Spee's heavier armament, Harwood decided to split his force in two, very clever move, and try to divide her main guns. Excellent tactic. And Exeter closed to the northwest. So there's the Exeter closing to the northwest, while Ajax and Achilles worked round to the north. There they are working round to the north. And all three Royal Navy and Royal New Zealand ships firing as they maneuvered. And the Graf Spee concentrated her two 11-inch turrets on Exeter, which was badly hit. So there she is, and she was badly hit. And by 6:50, all ships, including Graf Spee, were heading west. So here we are. They're all heading west now. Exeter with only one turret in action and on fire. And she had to break off and headed south for the Falkland Islands. So they're all heading west. And the Exeter was by then very badly damaged and had to head south for the Falkland Islands. And the Ajax and the Achilles continued to harry the Graf Spee from the north. There we are. And by 7:25 in the morning, Ajax lost her two after turrets to an 11-inch hit. That's where she got hit at approximately 7:25. Achilles already had splinter damage, but still the Graf Spee failed to press home her advantage. And by 0800 hours, still with only superficial damage, the Graf Spee, here she is, headed for the neutral Uruguayan port of Montevideo with Ajax and Achilles shadowing. And the Graf Spee entered the port of Montevideo at around midnight. So here's the Graf Spee anchored in the harbour of Montevideo following the battle. And as the Graf Spee lay at anchor, a huge diplomatic battle now ensued between the British, German and Uruguayan governments. This at the time received absolutely huge press and radio coverage around the world. And the British contested under international law the Graf Spee be made to leave port 24 hours after its arrival. And the Germans argued the ship needed 2 weeks of repair and was by no means seaworthy to make the perilous journey back to Germany should she escape. What is now known, from what my research says, is that a primary reason why the Graf Spee needed lengthy repairs before potentially putting to sea was because the engine room of the Graf Spee had suffered some serious damage inflicted by shells from Exeter that had wrecked the system for refining and turning oil from its tanks into a usable type to run the engines of the Graf Spee. And without these repairs, she would have only had enough fuel to cover a very short distance out of Montevideo. In addition, the main kitchen galley had also been destroyed, as well as the water desalination plant, and the bow had a large 5-foot hole that have greatly endangered the ship in the rough waters of the Atlantic. And let's just look at the Graf Spee. There on the port side bow of the Graf Spee is damage to the hull that was caused by a penetration of a 152 millimeter shell. Pretty large hole there. And here a close-up view from the port side showing the hull damage near the third 15 centimeter turret and the destroyed Arado aircraft that I talked about earlier, completely burnt out, and lots of splinter damage here. And interesting, if you take a starboard view of the Graf Spee, there was very little damage on the starboard side. You can see splinter shells, but she was virtually undamaged on the starboard side. She took all the damage was done on the port side. So under intense pressure from all sides, the Uruguayan government decided on a deadline of December 17th, thus allotting the German warship a mere 72 hours for repairs. And during this time, the British began circulating rumors that a large British attack force led by the battleship HMS Renown, along with the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, were lying in wait for the Graf Spee just outside of Uruguayan waters. Articles appeared in the press in Britain stating this, and the BBC broadcast the same story to the world, although there was, of course, no truth to the story. But Langsdorff believed the reports to be accurate. And much of this deception was very masterfully and cleverly orchestrated by the minister in the British Embassy in Montevideo, Eugene Millington Drake, who was in fact related to Sir Francis Drake, and one of our members here, Caroline Mowbray, her family knew Eugene Millington Drake very well. So on December 16th, Captain Langsdorff telegraphed the German Admiralty that his situation was dire and escape hopeless. And after an emergency conference, Hitler allegedly approved the following cable: attempt by all means to extend the time in neutral waters, fight your way through to Buenos Aires if possible, no internment in Uruguay, attempt effective destruction if ship is scuttled. Given this list of options, Langsdorff chose the latter and made the proper arrangements to save his crew. I think from everything I've read, he was very keen to save his crew. He saw little point in, wasting lives of young sailors, many of them only some 18 to 21, if that. So the Graf Spee's entire complement of over 700 men transferred off the Graf Spee and alighted onto tenders to go ashore. They all eventually moved to Buenos Aires, where they were all interned. And here we have the Graf Spee. At 6:15 p.m. the same day, Langsdorff and a skeleton crew weighed anchor, witnessed by an immense crowd of thousands, and steamed slowly seawards. 4 miles out of the harbour, the Graf Spee suddenly stopped. Soon after, she was rocked by 6 huge explosions, which tore the ship apart, and sinking soon afterwards. And Langsdorff and his skeleton crew had then obviously departed prior to the explosion by the Graf Spee launch for Buenos Aires. And here's the Graf Spee on fire and burning. And here's another grim picture of her going down. As I say, my mother remembers the explosions very well in Buenos Aires. It was so loud she could even hear it in Buenos Aires. So at 8:45 p.m., Ajax reported to Harwood that the Graf Spee had blown herself up, thus bringing to a conclusion the first surface challenge by the German Navy to British merchant ships and other Allied ships on the open oceans. After earlier attending and overseeing burial services for his crew in Montevideo, who had been killed on the Graf Spee, and faced with the loss of his command and the destruction of the Graf Spee, Langsdorff eventually retired to his hotel room at the Naval Hotel in Buenos Aires. And finally, on December 20th, 1939, he did what he believed was his honorable duty. He shot himself in the head with his service revolver. Now, Langsdorff was later buried in Buenos Aires, Argentina, at La Chacarita Cemetery with full military honors. The remaining crew of the Graf Spee were interned in Argentina until the end of the war, when in 1946, some were repatriated to Germany. And here we have the funeral procession of Captain Langsdorff. Left to right, you have Corvetten Captain Karl Klepp, Frigate Captain Paul Ascher, and Corvetten Captain Jürgen Wottenberg. And Paul Ascher escaped and returned to Germany, but was killed when the Bismarck was sunk on the May 27, 1941. Wottenberg here became a successful U-boat captain and was later captured, became a POW in the United States. And here is the German section of La Chacarita Cemetery, Buenos Aires, buried either side of the captain, Langsdorff, our Graf Spee sailors who died while interned in Argentina. On a recent trip I did back to Buenos Aires, my daughter was doing a lecture there at the university. I never got to this, but these pictures were taken by the person I mentioned earlier, who's been involved in the military society here. Here's the grave of Captain Langsdorff at La Chacarita Cemetery, Buenos Aires. So a summary, the Kriegsmarine, one Panzer ship, pocket battleship, 11-inch guns, casualties, 36 dead, 60 wounded, and on the Royal Navy, Royal New Zealand Navy side, one heavy cruiser, the Exeter with 8-inch guns, 2 light cruisers, the Ajax and the Achilles with 6-inch guns. Exeter very badly damaged, Ajax and Achilles damaged, total of 72 dead, 7 on Ajax, 4 on Achilles, and 61 killed on Exeter with 28 wounded. Now, this is interesting. I found this. Lieutenant Ron Atwell, Royal Navy, who served on Exeter during the Battle of the River Plate. These are his words below from his article in the March 1977 edition of our Naval Historical Review of our society here in Australia. He said, so listing heavily to starboard, they're still burning forward, and our battered ship turned towards the Falkland Islands, 1,200 miles away. We made good speed, about 80 knots. The weather was kind, although it worsened towards the end of our journey. 3 times during that long trip, we stopped to commit our dead to the deep. We arrived at Port Stanley with 62 officers and men no longer on board. They obviously were buried at sea en route. And here are the graves of 4 crew members from HMS Exeter who later died from their wounds and were buried on the Falkland Islands. And below, here's some crew from the Exeter on the Falkland Islands who survived the battle. They're looking pretty damn happy, as you can imagine. And here are some nurses from the British Hospital in Buenos Aires. My mother remembers this story very well, led by Dr. Petty and Dr. Pennington. I think they were both English. They were taken to the Falkland Islands on the SS Lithuania to take care of the wounded from HMS Exeter. And this is an extract from the local newspaper in Buenos Aires. You see how they refer to the Malvinas. As you know, the Argentines call the Falkland Islands the Malvinas. So, some conclusions. A stunning victory and a major boost to morale was achieved early on in the war at the Battle of the River Plate by the Royal Navy and the Royal New Zealand Navy, together with some ingenious deception orchestrated by the famous Minister Eugene Millington Drake of the British Embassy in Montevideo. The Panzer ship was no longer seen as being invincible. Hitler became nervous about committing Kriegsmarine battleships to future encounters with the Royal Navy. And particularly after the sinking of the Bismarck on the 27th of May, 1941, the Kriegsmarine battleships were largely confined to local German waters. Hitler gave strict orders forbidding General Raeder to dispatch any more battleships into the Atlantic. It did happen, but he basically forbade it. All merchant raiders, only merchant raiders armed with heavy weapons and heavily camouflaged to disguise them were allowed out to sea. And we know what damage the Cormorant did, of course, to the Sydney. And the key priority for the Royal Navy became the Battle of the Atlantic and the massive threat from U-boat attacks on Allied convoys that, if it had succeeded under Grand Admiral Raeder and Dönitz, could have so easily strangled Great Britain and tilted ultimate victory in favour of Nazi Germany. And the famous statement by Churchill, the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Here's a picture, finally getting to the last final slides, of the Graf Spee at the Spithead Naval Review, representing Germany at the coronation of King George VI. Quite magnificent. You see the huge German eagle on the back here with the swastika. And here's a wonderful picture taken on November 20th, 1939. Graf Spee in a storm on the Indian Ocean, and water's covering just the stern area of the deck here, and there's the torpedo launchers. Quite a swell there. Here's a magnificent portrait of the Graf Spee, artist unknown, but what an incredible looking ship, quite amazing. So This is a picture from Das Boot by Wolfgang Petersen, the famous film. And so that's the end, ladies and gentlemen. So if we have any questions or whatever we want to do next.
Do we have any questions?
Okay, I have a question. So some historians who have written about the Battle of the River Plate and specifically about Harwood's action commented that he perhaps had in mind, like personally, I think Harwood would have attacked whatever, because that's the tradition of the British Navy. But Harwood perhaps had in mind what had happened during World War I in 1915, when the German battlecruiser Goeben and light cruiser Breslau pretty much went right across the Mediterranean Sea to Turkey. And the only chance the British had of stopping Goeben and Breslau were 4 armored cruisers and about 8 or 9 destroyers led by Admiral Trowbridge. And Trowbridge decided not to engage. And the fellow who was the First Lord of the Admiralty at that time, of course, was Churchill. And the fellow who was the Lord of the Admiralty at the time of the River Plate, as far as I know, was Churchill as well. So I wonder if you'd like to make a comment on that, or any observations, perhaps.
So your question is, Kez, sorry?
So I was just wondering what you thought about what those historians, some of those historians who write about the River Plate said that, you know, to paraphrase, no doubt Harwood had in mind the fate of Admiral Trowbridge, who failed to bring the Goeben to action in 1915.
Well, what I would say is the following. When I used to talk to my father about, you know, when he went to action stations, I said to him, well, what was normally the order? And he said there was only one order in the Royal Navy, and it was called engage the enemy. The Royal Navy never ran away. It normally always engaged the enemy. And this actually, you know, has been going on since, as we know, Nelson's time. So you go into attack, sort of, you know, the best form of defense is attack. And we know that this sort of petrified many navies during the Second World War, you know, the Italian Navy or whatever. So I think, you know, there was just a tradition in the Royal Navy, always has been, you attack. There is only one order, engage the enemy. And
Yeah,
that's what it's called.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's just, you know, Trowbridge, his career was ruined after that, even though he was exonerated by a court-martial. I just thought it was an interesting parallel.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think what is interesting is you've got to wonder why Langsdorff didn't sort of, I mean, they had 11-inch guns. So, I mean, those shells, as I understand it, can travel 15 miles. They could have stood off and could have quite easily destroyed the British force long range. And there's no way that the Royal Navy could have got at the Graf Spee, but he actually went in very close. And funny enough, of course, he had specific orders not to avoid engaging the Royal Navy. His orders were to sink merchant ships and cargo ships in the South Atlantic. For God's sake, don't get involved in a fight with the Royal Navy. So he, in a way, disobeyed orders himself, Langsdorff.
So if he had come out to fight rather than scuttle the ship, obviously Ajax wasn't in very good condition. Achilles was better. Cumberland was there by that time, I think.
Yes, yes.
Were there any other heavy units in the vicinity, or just those three?
No, they were en route, but they were not available to deploy against the Graf Spee. But back to my earlier point, as I understand it from my research, and of course you have to make your mind up because there's so much information out there, you have to decide what you're going to say about this. But there was not sufficient time to do the repairs to the Graf Spee that would have enabled her for a long journey back to Germany. You know, the damage to the engine room, other problems would have meant they might well have petered out somewhere, you know, outside 200 or 300 nautical miles or whatever, outside Montevideo, and have been a sitting duck. I mean, clearly the Ajax, Achilles and so on were no match for the for the Graf Spee. But the point is, this was where the massive, fantastic, ingenious deception by Millington Drake came in. Langsdorff was fooled into thinking there was this huge armada of Royal Navy ships waiting for him outside. There weren't. And
So
you've got to say that the art of deception is very, very, very relevant in warfare.
Indeed. Luckily, then Langsdorff was not a diehard Nazi. Otherwise, perhaps he would have just realized there was no hope of going back to Germany. But let's go out there and go down in a blaze of glory.
Well, I think the point is, and again, that I've read is that, and I've listened to, in fact, only last night, I was listening to accounts of people speaking, his crew, including his sort of main, I think it was his flag officer, basically said that he very much admired Langsdorff in the sense that he saved, 1,000 of his crew. He saw little point in there being a slaughter of all these young Germans. He was prepared to scuttle the ship and save all his crew. And he committed suicide himself because he thought he basically screwed up, to put it bluntly. But his main motivation was to save his crew.
I think also one final point. I seem to remember, because my mum's German, right? And
Yes.
you remember that old British war movie about the Battle of the River Plate.
Yes.
And
I was watching it the other night briefly.
Yeah. And apparently in Germany, they were told that Langsdorff had died from wounds rather than committing suicide.
Yes.
I don't know if that's true.
Probably. It's called the Goebbels propaganda machine. You certainly don't want the German people to know at the time that he committed suicide. He died in an honourable way. It doesn't go down well for morale of the German people. So yes, no, it would have been papered over. I mean, a bit like, Rommel, same fate that Rommel, he committed suicide. Because he'd been, involved in the bomb plot and they thought he was working against Hitler. So everything gets papered over. It's the propaganda machine. We're seeing that in full swing today, aren't we, with the ghastly things going on in Ukraine.
Do we have any more questions?
I don't have a question, but I'd just like to say thank you very much. It's very interesting and gave a lot of information. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a comment from what I've read, Nigel, his religious background also played a part in this preserving life, having nasty things happen to people wasn't what his family was all about.
Very good comment. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I've read similar things. He was, in a way, quite a religious person. And, that's why not a single person, got killed during all these actions, sinkings. He respected, people's lives. And I think that was actually very unusual amongst German commanders in the Second World War.
The other thing is I've seen some photos with everyone around him giving the Nazi salute, but apparently he refused to identify with the Nazis and never, which infuriated Hitler, apparently, never giving the Nazi salute.
Absolutely. He always only ever gave the naval salute. He wasn't interested in this Nazi Heil Hitler business. Yeah. So, yeah, no, absolutely. That's another strong indicator of the strength of his moral compass.
All right. What a fabulous presentation. A very interesting story. So thank you very much, Nigel. Unless if there's no more questions. Well timed, Nigel. Right on cue. Thank you.
Well, we strand gropers try and get it right over here, I'll tell you.
Just in time for morning tea.
Yeah, we'll go back for morning tea. You lot will be heading for lunch or something then.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We had a good crowd of 47.
Oh, well done. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.